May 14, 1945. Grafenwehr, Bavaria. Sergeant John Wallace pushed open the wooden door, rifle raised, and froze. 3 children sat motionless on the stone floor. Their eyes were enormous in faces that were mostly skull. The youngest couldn't have been more than 4 years old. In the corner, their mother knelt with hands pressed together, not in surrender, but in prayer. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, hit like and subscribe to stay connected to untold stories of courage and humanity. Comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Wallace lowered his weapon slowly. He'd seen 11 months of combat across Europe. He'd witnessed bodies in ditches and cities reduced to rubble. But nothing had prepared him for this. Children too weak to cry, too starved to move. The house smelled of damp stone and nothing else. No cooking, no smoke, just cold emptiness. The mother's lips moved silently, forming words in German he couldn't understand. But he understood the desperation in her eyes. And in that moment, standing in that doorway between victory and aftermath, Wallace realized something the newspapers back home would never print. Winning the war was the easy part. What came next would test something deeper than courage. It would test whether mercy could survive where policy demanded distance, whether humanity could bridge the gap between enemy and victim. The answer would come in the form of a can of Spam and a choice that violated every regulation in the book. The war in Europe had ended 6 days earlier. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed unconditional surrender documents in Berlin. Church bells rang across America. Soldiers celebrated in the streets of Paris and London. But in the small villages of Bavaria, the silence was different. It was the silence of collapse. Grafenwehr had been a town of 2,000 before the war. By May 1945, refugees fleeing the Soviet advance had swollen that number to nearly 5,000. The infrastructure buckled, food supplies vanished. The black market charged prices only the wealthy could afford. Everyone else starved. Wallace was 26, from Iowa, the son of farmers who'd survived the Dust Bowl by sheer stubbornness. He understood hunger. He'd watched neighbors lose farms during the Depression. But what he encountered in Bavaria was different. This wasn't economic hardship. This was systematic collapse, a nation that had poured everything into war machinery, now facing the cost. The 3rd Infantry Division had taken Grafenwehr in late April after brief resistance. The military training ground nearby had been bombed repeatedly, leaving the landscape scarred and useless. Wallace's unit received standard occupation orders: maintain order, search for weapons, process displaced persons. Nothing in those orders prepared them for what they found in every house they searched. The Müller family was the first. Heinrich Müller had been a schoolteacher before conscription took him in 1943. Captured by Americans in France in 1944, he now sat in a POW camp somewhere, unaware his family was dying. His wife Anna remained with 3 children: Hans, 8 years old, Greta, 6, and little Friedrich, 4. When Wallace knocked, Anna opened the door with visible effort. Her dress hung on a frame that had lost perhaps 40 pounds. Behind her, the children sat because they lacked the energy to stand. Hans stared with eyes that held no hostility, no fear, just exhausted acceptance. Greta leaned against her brother, breathing shallow. Friedrich lay motionless against the cold floor. Wallace called for Private David Klein, his interpreter, who'd grown up speaking German in Milwaukee. "Ask her when they ate last," Wallace said. Klein translated. Anna's hands trembled as she answered. 3 days ago, potato soup, last potatoes. The non-fraternization policy was clear. Don't get friendly with Germans, don't share rations, maintain professional distance. The enemy might be defeated, but they remained the enemy. Wallace had been briefed on this policy repeatedly. Made sense in theory: maintain military discipline, avoid compromising situations, prevent sympathy for a nation that had started the war. But standing in that doorway, looking at children whose ribs stood out like ladder rungs, policy seemed abstract and irrelevant. Wallace made a decision that would either save lives or end his military career. "Wait here," he told Anna through Klein. He returned to the temporary command post in the village square. Captain Robert Morrison was reviewing requisition forms when Wallace entered. Morrison was 32, a Philadelphia lawyer in civilian life, practical and by the book. "Sir, we have a situation," Wallace said. "Civilian starvation." I just searched a house 3 kids who haven't eaten in days. And from what I've seen, half the village is in the same condition." Morrison set down his pen. He'd known this was coming. Intelligence briefings had warned about food shortages among German civilians. But knowing abstractly and confronting it directly were different things. "What do you want me to do about it, Sergeant? We've got rations. Reading 3 times a day. These people are dying. They're enemy civilians. They're children." The 2 men stared at each other. Morrison had spent 11 months enforcing military discipline, following orders, maintaining the chain of command that kept an army functional. But he'd also spent 11 months watching young men die for principles that seemed clearer in training than in execution. "All right," Morrison said finally. "Medical emergency exception to non-fraternization policy. You can distribute emergency rations to prevent imminent death, but document everything. If this becomes a scandal, I need paper trails showing we followed humanitarian protocols." Wallace returned to the Mueller house that afternoon with a box of rations, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, powdered milk. Not generous portions, but enough to keep 3 children alive. Anna saw the box and her knees buckled. She caught herself against the doorframe, tears streaming down her face. "Danke, danke." Wallace opened a can of Spam, cut it into pieces with his utility knife, handed portions to each child. They ate slowly, their stomachs too shrunken to handle much food at once. "Tell her they need to eat small amounts frequently," Wallace said to Klein. "Too much at once will make them sick." The transformation wasn't immediate. Hans took his piece of meat and held it for a long moment, as if afraid it might vanish. Greta ate in tiny bites, her eyes never leaving the food. Friedrich, the youngest, needed his mother to help him chew. But slowly, deliberately, they ate. Word spread through Grafenwehr like wildfire. By evening, a line had formed outside the command post, mothers with children. Elderly people who could barely walk, a few men too old or injured for military service, all of them starving, all of them desperate. Captain Morrison looked at the line and made another decision that violated policy. He authorized ration distribution to anyone who could demonstrate genuine need. The criteria were simple. If you looked like you were dying, you got food. Wallace and his squad, 8 men who'd fought from Normandy to Bavaria, became an impromptu relief organization. They moved through the village house by house, assessing conditions, distributing rations, trying to prevent deaths that would happen if they did nothing. Private Tommy Martinez from Texas carried a little girl named Liesel for blocks to the medical station because she was too weak to walk. Mother walked beside him, crying, apologizing in broken English, thanking him over and over. Martinez, who'd shot German soldiers in combat 3 weeks earlier, felt something crack inside his chest. How do you reconcile the enemy you fought with the child dying in your arms? Corporal James O'Connor from Boston found an elderly couple in their 80s who'd been locked in their apartment for days, unable to descend the stairs for lack of strength. He carried them down one at a time, settled them in the makeshift aid station, brought them soup he'd made by mixing rations with hot water. The old man gripped O'Connor's hand and wept. Private First Class William Chen, Chinese-American from San Francisco, discovered a woman trying to nurse an infant despite being so malnourished she'd stopped producing milk. Chen brought powdered formula, showed her how to mix it, stayed while the baby drank. The woman kept repeating "Danke, danke," until Chen had to look away to hide his own tears. Not everyone approved. Sergeant Carl Davis, who'd lost his brother at Omaha Beach, confronted Wallace one evening while they inventoried remaining rations. "You're giving food to the people who started this war," Davis said. His voice was flat, controlled anger barely contained. "I'm giving food to children who didn't start anything," Wallace replied. "Their parents voted for the regime. Their fathers served in the military, so they supported everything that led to this." Wallace didn't have a good counter-argument, because Davis wasn't entirely wrong. Collective guilt was a complicated question. But individual starvation wasn't complicated at all. "Look," Wallace said, "I can't fix the past. Can't bring your brother back or undo the war. But I can give a can of Spam to a 4-year-old who's dying. So that's what I'm doing. It's not justice. It's mercy. Sometimes that's more important." Davis walked away without responding. But the next day, Wallace saw him carrying a bag of rations into a house where a family of 6 was living in 2 rooms. Davis didn't mention it. Wallace didn't ask. Some transformations happened without words. By the second week, the immediate starvation crisis had stabilized. People were eating enough to stay alive. But malnutrition had done damage that food alone couldn't fix. Children developed vitamin deficiencies, bleeding gums, night blindness, muscle weakness. The elderly's immune systems collapsed, leaving them vulnerable to infections that would have been minor under normal circumstances. Then came the crisis that tested everything. 2 weeks after relief operations began, Wallace was called to a house on the village outskirts. A woman named Elizabeth Hoffman had barricaded herself and her 5 children inside, refusing American help. Wallace approached cautiously. Through the window, he could see children sitting on the floor, all clearly malnourished. One girl, maybe 6 years old, lay motionless. "Frau Hoffman," Klein called in German. "We're here to help. Your children need food and medical care." No response. "Please let us help." The door cracked open. Elizabeth stood there, around 40, her face hollow, eyes burning with rage and desperation. She shouted in German, voice rising. Klein translated. "She says we're the enemy. We destroyed her home, took her husband, bombed her city. She says she'd rather die than accept anything from us." Wallace looked past her at the children 3 to 12 years old, all unnaturally still, the smallest girl unmoving on the floor. "Tell her I understand her anger," he said. "She has every right to hate us. The children don't deserve to die for that hatred." When Klein translated, Elizabeth's face collapsed. She fell to her knees, sobbing with the force of years of fear and grief. Propaganda, ideology, none of it mattered beside her daughter's life. Wallace waited. Trauma needed space. When she finally looked up, her voice trembled. "Help them. Please help them." The youngest girl, Anna, was critical. Shallow breathing, weak pulse, icy skin. Wallace radioed for evacuation. Medic Tony Ritchie carried her out, starting an IV as his driver sped toward the clinic. Elizabeth tried to follow on foot, but Wallace put her in the jeep. At the clinic, Captain Hayes worked urgently. Anna survived by less than an hour. Elizabeth stayed 3 days. On the 3rd, she approached Wallace. "I teach English before war," she whispered. "I teach Americans are cruel, everything the regime says. I believe this. I teach this." Tears streamed down. "I was wrong. You saved my children. I am sorry. Your children are alive," Wallace said. "That's what matters." Weeks passed, and Grafenwehr changed. Civilians became people with histories. Soldiers trained to see Germans as enemies began seeing individuals. Martinez learned that little Liesel loved to sing. Connor discovered the Bergmans had run a bakery before the war, Herr Bergman describing recipes as if memory were nourishment. Chen befriended Stefan, a teenager dreaming of rebuilding Germany as an engineer. These connections weren't official. They skirted non-fraternization rules. But sustained dehumanization was impossible when meeting humanity every day. Wallace often visited the Mueller home teaching Hans English, showing Greta card games, telling Friedrich about Iowa. One evening Anna asked why he helped. "He needed help and I could provide it, but we are the enemy. You're a mother trying to keep her children alive. That's human." She hesitated. "Dada. My husband Heinrich is in American camp. Do you know how prisoners are treated? They get food, shelter, medical care. He'll come home." Anna's eyes filled. "For 3 years I think he is dead or suffering. You say he is safe. This changes everything, I believe." In June, orders came to transfer divisions. The night before departure, German families gathered in the square with what they could spare, ersatz coffee, bread from American flour, early vegetables. Soldiers brought cigarettes, chocolate, canned fruit. Wasn't a celebration, but an acknowledgement that something real had formed beyond the categories of enemy and liberator. Anna handed Wallace a small wrapped package, a hand-carved wooden horse. Heinrich makes these before war, for children. And once you have one for remember, I'll remember, Wallace said. Elizabeth Hoffman brought her children Anna, now strong enough to stand. They held crayon drawings for the Americans. I teach them truth now, Elizabeth told Morrison. The kindness is choice, not nationality. That Americans, who could leave us to die, chose instead to help. I teach them to be better than I was. The gathering lasted until midnight. Soldiers packed. Civilians prepared for new occupiers who might not show kindness. 40 years later, in 1985, a reunion was organized. About 50 people came, half American, half German. Wallace arrived with his wife. Anna and Heinrich came in their 80s. Martinez introduced his children to Liesel, now a music teacher. Morrison arrived despite failing health. Elizabeth crossed the Atlantic to thank the men who'd saved her daughter, now a physician in Berlin. The village had been rebuilt, the hunger and destruction gone, but memories remained sharp. They gathered in the church where Hayes had worked. Formal program dissolved as people began speaking directly, using broken language and gestures to bridge what words couldn't. Anna found Wallace in a pew. Your kindness meant proof that good exists even in war, she said. My children believe this. My grandchildren believe this because of you. I just gave you some rations, Wallace murmured. No. You gave dignity. You saw us as people. Heinrich approached, leaning on a cane. He extended his hand. Thank you for my family, he said simply. Elizabeth Hoffman found Morrison on the church steps. You saved my Anna, she said. Now she saves others. Doctor in Berlin, free clinic for refugees. She remembers being helpless and decides no one else should feel that way. Morrison smiled. It's a good legacy. Is your legacy? Your choice to help when you could walk away. The choice ripples through generations. On the final evening, they gathered in the village square. Heinrich spoke first, Anna translating. To the Americans who showed mercy when it wasn't required, who saw children instead of enemies. Wallace responded to the German families who survived terrible odds, who maintained humanity despite everything, who taught us our enemies were just people caught in the same machinery, Morrison added. To the choices we make in the margins when conscience guides what policy ignores, Elizabeth said, voice shaking. To second chances, to redemption. To learning the enemy is just another human trying to survive. Later, Wallace stood with Anna and Heinrich under the same stars they'd seen in 1945. Do you think it mattered? He asked. In the grand scheme, did it matter? Anna didn't hesitate. It mattered to us. To every child you saved. To every family who learned Americans were not monsters. That is enough. Feels small compared to everything else. History is made of small moments, Heinrich said. Feeding a hungry child, showing mercy to an enemy, those shape how we remember and what world we build. The veterans of Grafenwehr began dying in the 1990s. Wallace passed in 1998. Morrison in 2001. Martinez in 2003. One by one, the generation that fought the war and chose mercy faded, but their stories remained. Anna Mueller died in 2006. At her funeral, her eldest son spoke of the wooden horse returned after Wallace's death. This horse represents a choice. An American soldier could have walked past our house. Instead, he chose to see children who needed help. That choice shaped who our mother became and who we are. The wooden horse now sits in a museum in Grafenwehr, part of an exhibit on the post-war occupation. Visitors read the story: soldiers feeding starving civilians, violating policy in service of conscience. Some find it inspiring, others complicated, but many miss the point. Starvation isn't a policy debate. It's children dying, and the only moral choice is to save them. The children saved in Grafenwehr grew up to rebuild Germany, their descendants scattered across the world. Some know the story and carry it forward, living proof of what happens when mercy overcomes hatred. The lesson is simple. Even in war's worst moments, we can choose mercy. A quiet yet powerful act that defines our humanity. Those choices ripple through generations, shaping how people remember us and how they learn to treat one another. The wooden horse sits in its case, testimony to a choice made long ago, a reminder carved into time. When we can alleviate suffering, we do. Everything else is justification for turning away, nothing more than a fragile excuse.